Sure, yeah. Quick question. Um, After this event and stuff, would you be okay if I posted our talk on MinMax? The answer can definitely
Yeah,
be no.
no, that's fine.
Okay.
OBS was not recognizing my mic because it defaulted to a different mic, but we're good now. All right.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so I know you're preparing for a specific event that's starting this Saturday, the BCDL in Columbus, Ohio, right?
Correct, yeah.
So what I always ask people is, what is their expectation of, what decks are going to be represented? Not necessarily percentage wise, just like top five is good enough. Because I think
Sure.
trying to get the exact percentages doesn't really make a lot of sense because there's a lot of variability, a lot of volatility there that is basically
Yes.
unpredictable.
Yeah,
So,
totally agreed.
well, what are your top five, or even maybe even top 10, I guess, if you want to go that granular?
So top five is so number one, it definitely is Naya Depths.
Okay.
Um, we get a very, very large amount of Naya Depths players at every
Mm-hmm.
event, and they always do exceptionally well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the number one. Let me pull up quickly. I had a list. Oh, sorry. I had a list of the last several events, but basically what ends up happening is it's like Naya Depths, Stompy varieties, so both 8 cast and mono red
Mm-hmm.
are present at all times.
Mm-hmm.
Um, let's see what else. Uh, there's not really a ton of Delver, but the people who do show up with Delver are either extremely bad or extremely good. No in
Okay.
between. And I would
Fascinating.
also say just what's that?
That's interesting to note. Yeah.
Yeah, and then finally, a disproportionate number of lands and elves as well.
Mm-hmm.
Let me pull up the. I think I sent it to you already, but the last one.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, here it is. The last one was won by Reanimator, for example, and there were two Naya Depths in the top 8 alone, and then a bunch throughout the rest of the day. So, like, if you look at the number of deck breakdown according to Melee, there's 6 Naya Depths in the entire room with 4 DNT and 3 Mono Red Prison.
And there was a total of let's see, how many, 37 people.
For this one, yeah. And if I were to look at like some of the other ones, for example,
Mm-hmm.
they're all around. So this is the lowest attendance one.
Okay.
The one
Sure.
that just happened. Um, let's see, the one before then, for example, is this one right here, which was won by Naya Depths, and that
Mm-hmm.
one had Delver being and that one had 62 players with Delver and Jeskai Control being the top, and Naya Depths being the top represented decks.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But that was I don't know. That one was a weird event because Delver did not do well at all. So
Mm-hmm. So I think the safe thing to say is really that you're concerned about a few decks, but it's not it's not a good idea to say, okay, this will definitely be number one or this will definitely be number
correct.
two. It's
Yeah,
just
I
the
don't want a
top,
hard skew.
yeah, top five. Um, so the thing I wanted to note is if you're worried the most about Naya Depths, the way this deck is constructed is not particularly good in that matchup.
Yeah,
And well,
yeah,
what I mean
and
is I built my deck for Legacy Pit with Naya Depths in mind. And I'll show you the quick comparison between our two decks.
sure, yeah.
So I had two Brazen Borrowers, which is obviously a lot. I have 0 Ledger Shredders because I didn't really expect, or I felt like I could win most of my mirrors without even having Ledger Shredder in my deck. So kind of what's the point? And the card's not really ever really that bad. It's like Brazen Bar is probably at its worst versus control decks, but still not even that bad. It's only it's kind of just average there,
Okay.
A lot of specifics about this deck are not things I would do in the future, but I think I had a very coherent plan versus Naya Depths, including the sideboard Caracas, including Submerges. I mean, I think Caracas is actually incredible right now for a bunch of reasons. Even though it doesn't really cast many spells in your deck, obviously. Like, the spells it casts are Unlicensed Hearse, and, Delving for Murktide, or, Brazen Borrower. Those are literally the only spells it casts, really. So, I think Caracas is really good if you expect to have 9 Adepts. It has applications versus the control decks, too, you know that. A lot of the control decks are still soft to Caracas, which I find kind of surprising,
Extremely so, yeah.
Yeah, so that's why I kind of wanted to play it there. I think it's just it's kind of nice to have. It has like weird fringe applications versus like death and taxes as well. I think it just does so many small things that it's worth having, especially being good in one of your worst matchups.
Yeah. No, and that makes a lot of sense. Could you elaborate on what you wouldn't do in the future based on this list?
Yeah, I think Chain Lightning kind of can just go. If you want Delirium, you can probably achieve it in better ways. Playing a second Bobble makes a lot of sense. I was actually okay playing only one Pyroblast main, but that's like very meta dependent. It's just because I expected a lot of Naya Adepts at the top tables. You can play 2, that's also fine. Let's see, anything else? I'm not sure you need the second Hydroblast, but I was kind of paranoid about Moonstompy and Minx and Boo, so I just played 2. But unclear if you need to do that. And if you don't expect a lot of 8 cast, I'm not even sure you need the Meltdown, but it's so high impact to have the first copy of that I think it's reasonable to do that. So I just wanted to point out those brief things that I actually do think make my matchup versus Nideps way better than the version you're proposing. Those are things you can just do. You don't necessarily need the second Borrower. You don't necessarily need the second Submerge, although I think it's probably correct to have it, given that there's elves as well,
Yeah, I do agree with that, for sure.
Yeah, so those were just the short note things. And also, I think not playing the 4th Wasteland, if you expect Nideps, is also kind of weird. And I kind of feel like cutting Wastelands is only good if you expect to play tons of the Mirror, which I actually looked at a bunch of lists before talking to you about this. It looks like you based your list on Stefan's list from a prelim.
I did. That is exactly correct. Well, I actually talked to Stefan about it specifically, too.
Yeah, but the thing is, like, that list is very designed for a very specific metagame, I would say. It's very designed for, like, blue mirrors, as you can tell. And by cutting the 4th Wasteland for, like, an IRL event where you expect a lot of Nine Adepts, I think it's going to cost you so much, and you probably shouldn't do that. I'm always hesitant to cut Wasteland from the main deck. I'm just going to play it in the main deck most of the time just for Wasteland and sideboard it out if it's like kind of mediocre or not great, So
that makes sense.
I think just from like a try to be good versus unknown things perspective, playing 4 Wasteland in your main deck is a good way to do it. And also kind of insulates you from not being able to cast Ledger Shredder on turn 2 just by playing that 19th land. So probably what I would do is I would really ask yourself how many 1-drop removal spells you want to play, because there are a lot here. And the problem, in my opinion, with Unholy Heat is that it's weird, because I think when it's fully powered, it's, obviously kind of great, but that also implies that you're in a matchup where you have to kill a creature or a planeswalker. There's some decks that don't require that, in which case you're going to draw an Unholy Heat, and it's not great. Of course, it's not a valid argument all the times, because that's like the same argument you can use against Swords to Plowshares. But that's why I don't really like playing more than 1 Unholy Heat. Personally, I would probably just play 4 bolts before the first heat. But if you are going to play 2 Unholy Heats, it does make sense to play all these baubles, obviously. And I mean, I guess you also have the argument that you can loot Unholy Heat away to Ledger Shredder, but that's also kind of not a valid argument, because you can loot any card away to Ledger Shredder.
Yeah, I'm not remotely that attached to Shredder after I thought about it more also, just because, I
mean, it does some really nice things, but I also am hesitant to play more than the first copy in this format. And the reason being, I think a lot of the games you win are due to mana efficiency, and you're introducing another clunky card into your main deck by doing this. So I think if you want to play Shredder, my suspicion is the first copy is the best, and I probably wouldn't play a second copy personally.
Okay.
So I do this a lot in deck building, where I think about, okay, what happens if my opening hand has, two of in the opener in this sort of deck, and if you look at it, it's kind of disastrous to draw two of this card in your opener.
It is. Yeah,
it's
that's
not.
A good point.
It's not good. So the way you can actually eliminate that completely is to just only play one in your main deck. And I actually think the first copy is probably the best copy as well.
Would you like play Shredder or no?
I probably wouldn't, but it's not that clear. Like, I obviously did get destroyed by it, by like the matchup I played playing for top 8 of the pit, but I kind of think it is a liability in the mirrors a lot of the time, because it's kind of a clunky card that isn't Murktide and isn't iteration level, that, can be killed by Pyroblast even later on, and it's,
I think the reason I had Shredder in the first place is because I thought about endurances quite a bit when thinking about the deck.
Yeah, that's a reasonable thing to worry about, but like, the thing is, the way your deck is constructed, you're kind of soft to endurance unless you have Unholy Heat in game 1. Like, your DRCs and Delvers are basically going to just always get killed by endurance, unless if you're willing to give a lot of damage, which you probably shouldn't. You probably are supposed to just, like, most of the time, I suspect that in the matchups where there's a lot of endurances, you're supposed to just bite the bullet and, like, take the L. Because waiting versus decks is also not very good, generally speaking.
Yeah. That makes sense.
So, in general, versus endurance, like, I mean, the Brazen Borrowers sort of help there as well. I mean, it's not an ideal fix, but at least your creature doesn't get killed. Like, they spend 3 mana, you cast Unsummon, you get in some damage, and then you're like, okay, well, now I can't attack, because now I know they have it. And then you just try to figure out, like, a Murktide, or, like, find a Force of Will, or, maybe a Delirium to Unholy Heat, and try to deal with it that way. But in general, I don't think, like, it's worth worrying about endurance that much in a lot of games, unless if you're really far ahead. Like, I think the time you can worry about it is when you're really far ahead.
Sure.
So I think that's just, like, a general note. That's why I think, like, obviously Shredder, the one good thing about Shredder, and I think the real reason Stefan plays it, is this card is very good versus Graveyard Hate, and your other creatures aren't. Like, Delver of Secrets is fine versus Graveyard Hate, but also is small. Whereas, like, your bigger threats versus Graveyard Hate, they don't really work. Like, they just, don't work, period. So, personally, I would probably play, like, 3 Delver, 1 Shredder, and I would probably just try to sneak in 1 Borrower into this deck, if like, especially since you said you expected Naya Depths.
Yeah, I think that'll easily be the most popular deck in the room. Pretty well. Yeah.
If that's the case, then I think there is just a case to play 2 Brazen Borrower, and if also that's the case, are you sure you want to main deck 2 Power Blast? Like,
almost certainly not. Yeah.
Yeah,
that was another thing I was definitely thinking about.
Yeah, like, when I just showed you my list, the reason I played 1 Power Blast was I expected, like, a lot of Naya Depths or, like, Moonstomp or whatever nonsense. And if you go down 1 Power Blast and get 2 Brazen Borrower, like, it kind of works itself out in those matchups,
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think just like the way the deck is built, this is a very MTGO deck from Stefan, is how I would put it. And I think there's, like, this misunderstanding that, MTGO is the real metagame, IRL is not, but that's not the way you should actually approach it.
That doesn't matter at all. You're right.
Yeah, the way you should actually approach it is, okay, what do I expect people to do for this tournament in whatever area I live in, and adjust the deck accordingly, is the real crux of the matter here, is how I would put it.
Sure, that makes sense.
Just generally speaking, the Delver shell is so powerful. Like, the Izzet shell is so good that you can do that. You can just, like, move things around, and it will, like, change things meaningfully, because you see so many cards per game. Like, I would say this deck on average sees probably, like, 1/4 of its deck per game, if not more, depending on how long the game goes. Like, in a shorter game, it's like 1/6. or something like that. But in a longer game, like you can definitely get down to like 15 cards left in deck in a really, really long game.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So yeah,
so
go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say, so I'm looking at adjusting closer to almost exactly your main deck, but playing a second bobble instead of the chain lightning.
I think that's
what I'm
completely reasonable. And like, I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of Bobble in Legacy, but the card that it does work very well with is DRC, obviously.
Yeah.
And to a lesser degree, it does work well with Ledger Shredder. Although, like, since you're only going down to 1 at most, I'm not sure like how important that aspect is. But like, yeah, the DRC Bobble games, you just kind of feel like you're playing a different game than your opponent, you know?
Yeah, definitely. They definitely do.
One thing to note is I think Bobble is my most sided out card, especially versus decks that attack your graveyard, because it kind of just doesn't do much. Also versus
do you ever?
Sorry.
Just a quick side question: do you ever board out DRC against endurance decks?
I don't generally, because I think my plan versus decks is to submerge their endurance or like daze it or even force it if I have to.
Yeah. Okay.
I think the problem with doing that is you lose a lot of what makes you good versus those decks that are trying to cast a lot of expensive spells. You just don't lead off with creatures on turn 1 or 2.
Sure. Yeah.
Like, I basically think Delver is just like kind of... what's the best way of putting it? It actually, in some ways, resembles like Old Jund or Rakdos and Pioneer, in which like you can get under someone and just like remove all of their stuff or like counter their stuff and kill them. I've played a lot of Rakdos lately in Pioneer, so I've noticed the same phenomenon. Just the games where you lead off with an early creature are very, very different than the games where you don't. Where you're just kind of floating about like versus a control deck, then you lose because like, okay, you've gotten like a few 2-for-1s here or there, but like, they've cast a Teferi 5 or an Uro or a Minx and Boo or something like that. Something really powerful that is just better than what your deck represents because your deck isn't really... I mean, obviously you can grind out the long games, but in the end,
it's not well handled. That
I don't think you want... If you get to the board state where they have Carpet plus Minx and Boo, things are not pleasant, generally speaking, is how I would put it.
Sure.
So
that makes sense.
I think that's why I want to play a bunch of cheap creatures still, like, at least... I would say 7 1-drops is the minimum. And if you go to 8, that also makes sense. Depending on whether or not you end up on Shredder. I'll leave that as a personal decision to you. I don't think it's terrible to do it. I just also think it's kind of like... It's kind of weirdly awkward in a lot of ways because it forces sometimes bad sequencing.
It does. Yeah, that's the one thing I've noticed in my testing itself is that Shredder does sometimes create really awkward sequencing directions. And sometimes like it may not be right to do this, but sometimes you'll like if I have a DRC Bobble start, I might hesitate and wait on the Bobble activation in case I draw a Shredder on turn 2. But having to devote brain cells to that decision, I don't enjoy.
I think it just kind of depends. Like if your hand's set up like almost perfectly, and then you probably should wait. But if your hand is like missing something, like you don't have protection versus like a combo kill, or like you don't have a turn 1 removal spell or a daze or something like that, you're probably supposed to just fire it off and see if you find what you need immediately.
Yeah, which I totally do. It just like the extra iota of thinking about, okay, is my hand set up well enough for me to fade the necessary thing and get the value off the Shredder the following turn? Like that whole thing kind of bothers me a little bit.
Yeah, I don't think that's a good reason to not play it, but obviously it is a thing that can occur. But also, I think the mana curve thing is just more important, where that's why I would skew towards having more cheap plays than not. Yeah, so I think that basically summarizes what I would do with regards to the creature suite. Also, I don't think you can really have more than 14 creatures in your deck. I think like once you get past that point, you're like your Delvers stop working, your Murktides stop working. You just like draw hands that have too many creatures and not have spells.
Yeah. Yep. No, that makes sense. Okay. Awesome. Yeah, I'm convinced for sure.
Yeah, I think 14 is the limit, and that's where I went. But you could convince me 13 is correct as well, depending on exactly what creatures you want to play. You know.
Yep.
So I guess that covers like philosophically how I approach the deck for the most part. So Naya Depths, I think if you make the changes, I think you will see a significant difference in the game ones. One thing to note is the Brazen Borrower thing doesn't really work if they have Reclaimer out, obviously, for obvious reasons. So you're going to have to kill basically all Reclaimers on site. I think your list is actually probably good at doing that if you play the 4 Bolt and 1 Heat setup. And Heat can kill a Thresholded Reclaimer,
Correct. I'm somewhat fearful of playing the 4 Bolt 1 Heat split because if I do that, so like if we look at the changes right now, it would be -2 Shredder plus 2 Delver. That's the easy one. -1 Heat plus 1 Bolt. That's another easy one. -1 Blast and -1 Bobble for 2 Borrowers. But then we have 1 additional slot that needs to go to fit into 4th Wasteland, and that has to be the Heat.
Right. So
I guess yeah. So
I mean, if you really did you cut the Power Blast in that?
Cut 1 Power Blast. Yeah.
Okay. Wait, so is the Power Blast the Wasteland, or is it just the Power Blast the Bolt?
The Power Blast is the Wasteland. The 2 Unholy Heats became the 4th Bolt and 1 Borrower, and then the 3rd Bobble became the other Borrower. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I guess if you really don't think like you need to play a lot of punk out, damage your opponent games, you can play 3 Bolt, 2 Heat. I just found that like in a lot of the...
I think quite the inverse is true. I think you'll more frequently be doing the punk out thing.
Yeah, exactly. So I think like that's why I personally would probably play 4 Lightning Bolt, 1 Unholy Heat, and it's just nice to have 1 Unholy Heat to draw to when there are like things that you really need to kill that are kind of big.
Sure.
But
I'll see if I can consider making a like I don't know, the thing in my mind then would be like going down to 1 Borrower and then playing 1 Heat, or going down to 1 Bobble and then playing 1 Heat, or something along those lines. I don't know.
Yeah, it kind of depends. Like obviously Heat and Bobble are correlated. I mean, if
correct,
you can also just play 1 Brazen Bar. I think that's also reasonable if you want to do that.
Okay, I'll think about it more.
Yeah, I think that's just a personal call. That's not like there's no right or wrong. It also is just like how you want to play the deck, how you want to mulligan. Like, to be fair, playing 1 Borrower makes it a lot harder to find the Borrower in a timely fashion versus a Lage, versus playing 2, obviously. But I think that's fine.
And I think the biggest thing is in the matchup, especially like dynamic wise. I think the biggest thing that I've realized, it's maybe not that big of a realization, but like it's not really a Lage thing. Lage will happen if every other resource like gets exhausted.
That's exactly it. Like when I was playing Depths versus when I was playing Depths versus Izzet, I didn't really jam Lage very often, like because it wasn't necessary. I could just kill their stuff, make like giant knights, and they would run out of stuff because you don't have an infinite number of answers to like a 6/6 or a 7/7, or like endurances, or even like Elvish Reclaimers. So that's why I think like it's kind of crazy to just say that, okay, I'm going to answer a Lage and then they're going to lose, because that's not what happens. And that's why I think you also need to present a clock versus them. Because if you don't do that, then otherwise they can just sit around and like... I mean, I even played a game versus some Izzet Delver player in Baltimore where they weren't doing anything for like 6 turns in a row, so I just concluded they had Submerge. So I slowly rotated all my forests away and made Lage. And then they showed me a Submerge, but they only had 4 lands. I'm like, I don't have a forest. And they were like, oh. Because, like, basically most of the time, obviously, Depths has a forest out, but if you're going to just sit around like that, I'm just going to make sure you can't do anything, like, meaningful to my board.
Yep.
So, I think that's why, like, it's important to try to kill them. Like, I think a lot of that just has to do with the fact that in any matchup, just imagine what happens if 10 turns play out. on both sides. Just try to envision it. And if you think about it, Naya Depths is just going to keep playing enormous things until Delver runs out of answers. And like no number of two for ones are not going to help you enough to get out of that. Like they'll help to some degree, but eventually you're just going to run out. You're not actually killing your opponent.
Yep. That makes complete sense. I'm fearful of the games that do go too long, so that makes sense to me. Okay.
Yeah, so in that regards, I noticed you're not playing Price of Progress. It's funny because I don't think Price of Progress is actually that good versus Naya Depths, but I think it's valuable to have versus the other fringe decks that you did mention, like you know, lands, obviously, like if you set up a Price of Progress, it's generally going to be lethal versus them, like given how the games play out from your side versus their side.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I kind of wanted to pitch one more really quick thing as a note. I believe that due to the lack of Delver's success at these events, I think a fair amount. I know for a fact that at least one person will be, but I think there's going to be a lot more grindy combo there as well. So like Doomsday, I could envision seeing quite a bit of, which is the confirmed one, like Turbo Doomsday, not like the normal, or not. I guess not the Tempo Doomsday list or whatever.
Yeah. I think that matchup is generally good. Like
I do agree.
And the one important thing is, I don't like Turbo Mulligan versus them because I think they usually spend time setting up.
Yep.
And also I do think the lightning bolts make the game weirdly awkward for them to play. Like they have to do a lot of thinking if they actually should jam or if they need to like duress you for a lightning bolt or something like that, or like have a daze or a fluster. And also like win cons are good. Obviously the extra counters are good. You know, I think the most important point is like the slow win cons are not that good. Like Murktide region is not that good versus Doomsday, generally speaking.
Correct. Yeah.
And I'm speaking specifically versus Turbo. If you play against like the weird like Grixis, you know, side into Grixis mid range, you should not put Murktide region because that will just let you die to theirs. Generally speaking.
I guess can I ask you what I know you had a discussion with Samantha about her Tempo Doomsday list and like playing against Delver, and you made the comment after the pit open that your discussion with her helped her beat you. Could I ask a little bit about that just so I can learn from maybe the reverse?
So basically, I just told her that her deck wasn't playing enough lands, and she just had 2 preordains where I would add 2 lands because like I think the easiest way for that style of Doomsday deck to lose in a postboard game is okay. So you transition to Grixis midrange. How did Grixis midrange lose to Delver traditionally? It was usually on mana efficiency, like getting wasted a bunch of times and days being like kind of broken. So I was just like, well, if you add 2 lands, it stabilizes your mana base, and you can afford to get wasted a few times and not run out of lands instead of like dirtling around casting preordain.
That makes a lot of sense. Because the day before your coaching session with her, I actually playtested with her. And I think I came away like 4 wins to 2 or something like that. And the matches felt very lopsided, and I like just the wastelands were so dangerous. And
that's another reason why I don't really like cutting wasteland from Izzet in general. Like even if you could justify that, like okay, I have a better pre-board configuration in the mirrors because I have less wastelands, but I'm not even sure that's always true because I think there's like a subsection of games where, you know, it's not a large portion, but there is a section of games where someone's land light and a wasteland kind of like makes it hard for them to play the game very effectively.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it's like the whole phased Delver mirror thing that everyone talks about all the time, like the 3 phases or whatever Delver mirror.
Yeah, it's funny that people hyper focus for that being in Delver. I think that just happens with a lot of decks in mirrors. Like there are just like certain stages you have to pass through. Like the Phoenix mirror in Pioneer is like
the same thing. Yeah.
Well, it's super weird because like those games generally last a long time with Phoenixes being traded off, and what happens is whoever gets to resolve time stretch first is going to win. Like generally speaking. But then like time stretch costs so much mana versus like spell pierces and like you know other like conditional counters
and things like that.
So that one is weird. So it's just like I find it weird that people focus that act like this like triple stage thing applies only to Delver, and it's like, no, just like most mirrors have something that looks like this. It's just the terms and conditions are different.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah.
So I think what we should really like focus on is like the sideboard for other matchups that you care about. So maybe just like list off the second matchup you care the most about, and we can discuss it.
Let's see. Probably, I don't know. Naya Depths is like the huge one. Let's say Doomsday, just for an example.
Okay, so I think in the Doomsday matchup, like you have some cards that are not very good. Like Unholy Heat doesn't really do much, and
Brazen Bar doesn't do much.
Yeah, Brazen Bar doesn't do much, and like then I would start shaving Murktides. A side note, I'm like the least. What's the correct way to put it? I'm not a huge fan of Counterbalance in the sideboard, and there's a lot of reasons for it. I think
neither is Bob.
Yeah, I think it's just kind of bad, honestly. Like, I know everyone else plays it, and like you do have to counter it on site, but here's the thing: like, I think Unlicensed Hearse is the same card as Counterbalance, and versus combo, they're just gonna like cast their spells into it anyways. They're not gonna wait. Like, so it's just kind of like, it's just I think it's a bad version of a Licensed Hearse in the mirrors, if I had to guess. That's how I would put it. Of course, that's like not completely true. There are certain decks that it's very good against. But the other problem with Counterbalance is it's very resource intensive to keep up.
It is, to keep it afloat, yeah.
And also, like, if your cantrip is Ponder, like, then you have to figure out what's going to happen on their turn most likely, and then like set it up appropriately. So I'm generally not a huge fan of the card. I generally don't even play it. If I was gonna play it, I'd play the first copy and then probably not the second, because it's horrible to draw two. Whereas if you draw two Hearse, like drawing two Hearses in the mirror is actively good. They're like never going to be able to do anything relevant. Like all of their DRCs are off, all of their Murktides are off, their Sanctuary's gone, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, that's... I do like Hearse quite a bit, actually, and the more I think about it. And so, I mean, the sideboard is very tilted towards like what online sideboards look like. And I noticed a trend in paper for Delver lists specifically, not playing a lot of counterbalances. Like it's it's not very common, it looks like.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, if I were playing Legacy Showcase with Delver, I would also just not put counterbalance in my sideboard and play the Hearse plan as well. I think it's just like the Zoomer like information cascade where like the Zoomers do well with it, so people keep copying and pasting. But I don't think the card is actually good, personally.
Yeah. So, yeah, I could see that. I redid a little bit of the sideboard, and just our discussion with you, because I wanted to make space for that third Pyroblast and such, because I'm not playing 2 main deck anymore, but I still want the full 4.
Sure.
So I have 2 Force of Negation, 3 Blast, 2 Blue Blast, 2 Submerge, 1. I'll just type it in chat because it's easier.
Right. Okay, let's see. So you have 2 Force of Negation, 3 Power Blast, 2 Submerge, a Caracas, a Press of Progress, 2 Hearse, 2 Hydro Blast, a Meltdown, Rough Tumble, and Engineering Explosives. So yeah, with regards to Doomsday, I think the cards that are obviously coming in are 2 Power Blasts. You could make a case for Press of Progress, but I suspect that's like not really good enough.
It seems very trapping to me, yeah.
Yeah, so the 3 Power Blast and the 2 Force of Negation, I would cut 2 Unholy Heats, the whatever number of Brazen Borrowers, and then after that, probably Murktide Regents. And I think that is like a fairly clean way of doing it. I think you still have enough threats in your deck. It's just Murktide is so slow versus them, like that.
It is, yeah.
The games are kind of decided before that. Like, either if they've resolved the Doomsday and they're going through their pile very quickly versus you, and you're dead, or like they can't find a Doomsday to save their life, and in which case it doesn't really matter what creature you have because like all of them work.
How do you feel about significantly more narrow sideboard options? Like, I don't know, Flusterstorm is one good example, I suppose.
Hate it. Like, if
Yeah,
I think Flusterstorm's a bad spell pierce, personally.
yeah, I think I do too.
Because like you can spell pierce a Carpet of Flowers, and I think that's like kind of an underrated thing, personally. But I think spell pierce's time in this style of deck has aged not well. Mostly because like this deck can like make the games go longer, which is the problem. Then spell pierce loses its effectiveness like fairly quickly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's why you basically always see dual Force of Negation instead of like some spell pierce. Yeah. Like because that's just like the best card. Like it's also a card you can realistically hardcast like just as a dissipate for 3 mana. So that's why like I think you see that the most, and I think is just generally correct to have that card as a 2-of.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. Okay, then I guess the next deck I would be somewhat worried about is Death and Taxes.
Right. So I think first off, I guess describe to me how you envision winning versus Death and Taxes as a style deck, and then I'll tell you what I think.
Okay, so in the past, I've played. I'm going to give you two different answers, if that's okay. The first answer is from the perspective of past matchups that I've played with, for example, David Lance. And then I played a 4 bobble version of Delver, and like it was all chip damage all the time. Like DRC was the most important creature. Recovering from like removal spells, it was like having trading resources with them spending more mana on their resources and me just having 1-drop attack you a bunch. And at the time, I also played instead of any copies of Rough and Tumble, I played and the Festivities instead because the 1 damage mattered a lot in the way that I was playing those games. And I also played when David was originally testing out the Red Splash, so like the 1 damage from fetch lands also like it all added up to this own recipe.
Right.
Now, however, so say for example, we're instead of looking at this list with the Shredder, we're looking at the revised variation with the 4 Delvers and the 2 Bobbles and 2 Brazen Borrowers. I think with this list, I guess I should be clear about one more thing. With the old version, I also almost never got to do the protect a Murktide and ride that to victory thing because David had 4 blasts, 4 plow, 4 solitude against me. I understand it's an 80 card deck, and that was like my rationale was I didn't think I could play that game with a blue threat very well. But my guess is going forward, I think I have to kind of play that game still if possible, unless the other options available to me. That seems a lot less consistent, though.
Yeah, I agree with basically everything you said. The games you won versus TNT are either like you've actually gone zoo on them with like 3 power flyers by like turn 2, and you just like you stack the damage up, and then 2 or 3 bolts finishes them, or the Murktide like chomps down their life total in 2 hits. Obviously harder versus the Boros version of Death and Taxes, but you know I think it's still doable in some games, but it involves casting iterations to set up defense for it, you know,
for the Murktide, correct? Yeah.
So that's more of a game where like your mana's not under attack, you're not getting Thalia'd or whatever, and you can cast iteration, rebuy iteration, then they lose. Definitely agree with that. And like in that vein, like generally speaking, I don't usually have that many sideboard cards for Death and Taxes, but I mean, like, Engineered Explosives is okay for some, but I suspect it doesn't actually solve the primary problem in the matchup, weirdly enough. Especially since they're a Yorion deck, because their mana costs are just too spread out. Like
they are, and the EE specifically isn't necessarily for D&T. It's one of those, like, incidental splash cards. I think the EE, I talked to Jujubin about it quite a bit, and the idea was a kind of a split card that was good against the same decks that Meltdown would be good against, but also have application against the non-Meltdown part of a deck, or the part of a deck that doesn't get hit by Meltdown, if that makes sense. Like Mono Red is a good example. Or Chalice matters a lot more.
Well, I mean, the thing is, in that matchup, I think like Rough Tumble and Meltdown are pretty effective, and I'm not even sure you need Engineer Explosives versus them, because it's like E is honestly kind of bad versus Moonstompy. It's only good versus like the Chalice Crummox draw is how I would describe it. Like Meltdown does the same thing for 1 mana, I guess 2 because you have to get around Chalice generally.
Right.
But the problem I have with EE is that it's like just incredibly inefficient. Like it costs so much mana to kill anything that doesn't cost 0 with it.
I see. Yeah, okay.
So like I think the card I would consider in that spot instead is a Braid. And specifically, I think it has to be an answer to a Chalice of the Void. I think that's what that spot is earmarked for me. So if you go to a Braid, that gives you some leverage versus some other, like you can side that card in versus Death Taxes, and it's completely fine. You know? It's not, like, incredible, but it does the job you need it to do, which is, like, kill Barrow Skull, kill GT, kill early creature, you know?
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of Engineer Explosives. I'm also not a huge fan of End the Festivities, especially against like modern era Death and Taxes. Simply because I think like the way the matchups play out, the games go longer and they just don't expose that many X1s versus you. Like Rough Tumble killing Stoneforge Mystic actually matters a lot, I feel like. A similar thing happens with like elves or whatever you want to call the abomination nowadays. And the Festivities is like kind of a brick versus that deck. It doesn't actually do anything. So I also think Engineered Explosives is also not that good versus that deck anymore. Even though if you had in your sideboard, you would side it in, obviously.
Right. Interesting.
So I guess I'm making a case for not playing Engineered Explosives basically versus anyone. I mean, I would probably play it if I expected a lot of 8-casts, because it's the same card as Meltdown versus 8-casts, which is probably the reasoning the Zoomers played it for. Like, and it's slightly more flexible versus other decks, but I don't think the flexibility is worth like the inefficiency here.
I see. Okay. Would you, I guess, so let's say we turn that EE into an Abrade. Against D&T then, would the straightforward cuts would be like what? The main deck blast, obviously. And I know that you tend to board out the bobble in this matchup, but I don't think I should.
I think I would probably cut it, but it depends on how many cards you want to side in. If given what you have 2 Rough Tumble and 1 Abrade, right? So I would just cut 2 Power Blast and 1 Bobble.
And against red, obviously, you wouldn't bother boarding in.
The other thing is, like, if you expect them to rip you, Delirium's not even an issue. Like,
that's true.
Like,
that's super true.
And you can't cut Brazen Bar because it's actually good versus Rest in Peace as well.
It is. Yeah, it is.
So, like, also just the games versus D&T where you're winning are more tempo-y, and something like Brazen Bar actually is valuable, you know?
Yeah, that's super true. Would you consider boarding in any Blue Blast against the red version?
No, I think that's just like, that's a recipe asking for you to draw a Blue Blast when a game's close, but you're slightly ahead and you have nothing to target with it. Like, I think like the games actually do operate on such narrow margins, you know?
Yeah. That makes complete sense, and I do agree. I just wanted to ask the question.
I think like maybe you could justify 1, but I probably still wouldn't.
Sure.
Also, I'm low on Meltdown versus D&T unless if they show you specifically Urza Saga.
Agreed. Yeah, I'm in the same boat. Okay. I know you also don't like Maddening Hex. Also, especially not both at face value and also in this sort of predictable metagame.
I think the card is actually okay, but not great, is how I would put it. I think people are starting to play more Hydroblast anyway. If you want to like a 1 card, like, you know, Army in a Can or Wincon or however you want to put it, I'm not even sure that's the best one, really. I'm not even sure there actually is a good like 3 mana win the game card anymore. Simply because a lot of those like control decks or like, whatever. There's just a lot of blue blasts running around.
There are, yeah.
The matchup where I think you probably want it are like combo decks, probably. Like, I think it is like fairly difficult for a Doomsday to beat a Maddening Hex, but that also costs 3. Like I'm not sure. Like, if you want to play it, I think it's reasonable to play 1. But my instinct is to not play it unless if you have a very specific reason or matchup.
Sorry, I'm getting. Just 2 seconds. I'll be right back. Sorry. My silly Bluetooth audio. I'm going to reconnect the call and then I think we'll be okay.
Okay.
Ugh. I hate when this happens. Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm so sorry.
All right. Yeah, so Maddening Hex, I don't know. Like, if you play it, just have a very specific reason for why you want to play it. Don't just like toss it in there just because it looks cool. I honestly think that's why a lot of people play the card.
I do agree. Okay. So we've established sideboard to look more like what I sent you, I suppose. Would you play 2 Hearse in this metagame?
Yeah, I think so. Like, I mean, it's kind of weird because it's like honestly not that good versus Reanimator until you survive to it. Then it's like the best thing you can do. Like it's usually a 0 or a 10. Like there's no in between. Like, because by the time you get into play reverse Reanimator, you've generally won the game as it is. But it is quite good versus Reanimator once it's in play because it causes them like their deck does not function.
Yeah.
The other thing about Hearse is like I think it's just because of the mirror match. Like you've seen it pop a lot. If you actually don't expect a lot of the mirror, you can justify playing 1 and cut it for some other good like catch-all versus non-blue decks. Speaking of which, like versus most of the like 4-color control decks, I probably would have Hearse in my deck just to shut down Uro and Sanctuary.
Yep.
And
I like it a lot in that matchup in general.
It also is like technically like if they terminus you can just untap like play a creature, crew it, and hit them for some amount of damage.
Yeah. Hearse can be very dangerous in those matchups.
Yeah. So I like having 2. I could see playing only 1. But if you do, just have another card in mind for it.
So I just realized the sideboard I sent you, it has 16 cards in it.
Yeah, you probably shouldn't do that. Like, you could probably cut the Price of Progress or the Hearse, but it's more of like, Explosives becomes a Braid, then either Hearse or Price of Progress is probably the card to leave, in my opinion. And
what about Caracas?
Well, that we established that that's like a primary good weapon versus Naya Depths. Okay, versus Depths.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot about Depths for some reason. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think the better Delver players would play Caracas in this expected meta, personally.
Yep, that makes sense.
It's kind of funny because if you click on all of the on lists, basically no one plays it. Oh no, Binu has it. Never mind. Huh.
Yeah, Binu put it in.
That's interesting. I did not talk to like I know they're a Chinese guy and they played one of the set championships. I forget their real name now, but kind of funny because it's kind of hard to come to the conclusion that you should play Karakas unless you've played a lot of Delver. Like,
yep.
Because it doesn't cast anything in your deck is the real reason.
Yep. Would you play 2 Rough Tumble?
I think it's fine to do that if you want. At least one.
My consideration was not playing the Abrade and instead of playing Rough Tumble, but I don't think I can get away with that.
I mean, I think it's just a question of how well you think you can navigate like Moonstompy or like tribal-y style decks. Is how I would put it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it's probably going to be the Abrade and just have one of each.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you see a lot of cards. Also, Sanctuary lets you double up on them.
Right. Exactly.
Well, except you always need to find the first one for that to happen, you know?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. This has been very helpful so far. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of any other... Oh, I guess since this list does not have any like super slam dunks against, say, something like the basic variation of the 80 card 4-color control deck. Could I just get your 2 cents on how you would navigate that matchup?
I assume you mean the version close to what Nam played a few months ago.
Yeah,
let me just pull up that deck. I think that version is probably a lot harder. But I also think their mana kind of sucks, right?
I do agree.
So first up, don't side out Wasteland versus them. I think that's just like a mistake.
Yep.
Versus them, I probably still would have the Price of Arkerson because I think it's kind of hard for them to avoid getting a few duels in play. Like, especially if Uro's involved, they're probably going to have a bunch of duels in play. And this is a matchup where I do really like Hearse versus them. Like, because I think Uro is such a big part of their game plan. Personally, this is probably... this might sound like blasphemy. I do this a lot. Versus decks that have a lot of answers to Murktide, I just don't have that many Murktides in my deck.
Yeah,
I'll have like one or two.
Boarding out 1 or 2,
But, I mean, I understand, like, it can make the games tricky to play sometimes when you just, like, don't have a win con, but I think they're so good at killing Murktide Regent that it's, like, not worth it for it to be your primary plan, you know?
I guess would the primary plan just be, like, to try to tempo them out? Like, and be more efficient at things than them?
Yeah, you could do that. I've also toyed with the idea of siding out Lightning Bolt versus them, but that can like get weird, especially if Mix and Boo's involved. So I don't know. Like it gets kind of complicated. I would have to play some games versus that version of it to come up with a better plan. But generally, the way I want to beat them is like assume that they're not going to find one piece of the puzzle that they need to like win a game because they're an 80 card deck, and just try to choke them on that angle. Like if you see that like they've drawn a lot of like if it seems like they've drawn a lot of removal, try to like go into Iteration Sanctuary and like get a bunch of cards and then like deploy stuff. If they don't seem to have a lot of removal, just like go full court press and try to kill them.
How would you sideboard in that matchup?
That's the other thing. I think it depends a lot on how they sideboard. Like it gets kind of complicated. My suspicion is most of the time, Daze is not particularly good versus them, if I had to guess.
I would agree with that too. Yeah, because they go up to 3 to 4 carpets as well.
Yeah, but it also depends. I would actually watch how your opponent plays. If your opponent just plays into Daze all the time in game 1, even if Daze is not that great in the matchup, I might still just leave it in,
Yeah.
Like, there's a famous story, it's Gabe Walls playing Thopter Depths versus Burn in game 1, and he just noticed the Burn player never bolted his Jace, just always went for his face, so he just left in all of his Jaces. And then, like, sure enough, like, game 2 rolls around, the villain, like, just starts bolting Gabe, even when there's a Jace out, then Gab wins the match easily, because Jace... If you don't kill Jace, it's survived. Yeah, but, like, Jace could have died basically at any point in that game. So the point is not to have a static sideboard plan. It's to observe what your opponent does and develop the best plan versus them.
Yep.
So I think generally, versus most competent people, Daze is not going to be that good. But if someone's playing weird, just reconsider and like try to adjust on the fly.
Makes sense. Yeah, I that's the matchup that I expect to see maybe at the top tables, but not a ton during Swiss, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that deck is honestly like only okay, and it's really the players who play that deck who win with it are just better players. So I'm not
agreed as well. Yeah,
I think like it's a sweet deck to play if you just want to play with a bunch of like cool cards that cost a lot of mana. But I think inherently, like I'm not a huge fan of that deck, this style of decks anymore. It's just like I think fundamentally they're like kind of underpowered, and they're also like pretty clunky. Is the other issue. Like the games where they don't have Carpet of Flowers or like enough fetch lands to fetch only basics, it's pretty easy to attack them on some level that their deck. Like if they just draw a hand of like 2 fetches and no cantrips, they're gonna have to fetch like 2 non-basics and then like waste gets to prey upon them, you know?
Yep. That makes a ton of sense. I feel a lot better about just talking through decisions. I think has been really nice, and I can't like think of any additional points. I mean, so one of the reasons I really wanted to play Delver for this event specifically is because I don't, same as you, I was working on the based on what you just said, I was working on the Anurag 4-color control deck, but I did not really like that matchup against something like I don't know. I thought that deck was good if I expected a ton of other Delver in the room. And I had a game plan specifically towards more blue fair mirrors, but this metagame does not seem to really be like that, and it sounds like I believe it to be more a quote unquote bullshitty decks. Than something like that Anurag's list would be able to pull off. And I switched over to the Nam deck, the basic version. And I had a lot of clunky mana draws, and I kept losing to bullshit still. So I decided to pivot further and just go into the Delver thing.
It's funny because I think the Nam deck is also not very good versus BS. I suspect the version of that type of deck that's best versus BS is the CFT sock version, because it actually has a weird like combo endgame.
Yeah, it does.
Like the thing is, if you play that deck, you're going to have to play very well and very quickly, and also understand how like the endgame looks for you basically all the time. Yeah, I think that deck, like that person is just kind of a mad genius. Like I've watched a lot of the decks they played. They also played the one Arclight Phoenix 4 Monastery Mentor deck in Pioneer for that Mox. I'm just like, what the hell is this? This doesn't look very good. It also like didn't seem to make fundamental sense unless you wanted to beat green. Like that's the reason you get to that realization, because Monastery Mentor is much better than Arclight Phoenix versus Green Devotion. Because like the green deck doesn't have any removal except Skyboat. So like what happens is you cast Mentor, you cast a bunch of spells, then they're dead. Like, you know how it is. So I think that was just like a meta call for them. Like, they do a lot of weird stuff like that, but their decks usually work, but they work in such a way that like you have to play a lot of matches to understand how they work, is how I would put it.
Yes. Yeah, it was on my list to try the CFT sock, the one the showcase with.
Yeah, I've tried it. I think it's good, but it also like forces you to like be planning very early on for an end game that you have to understand how it works as well. Because I did not understand it the first time, and I still like barely understand it. I like sort of understand it, but not well enough to like take this deck to a tournament. Like it's very cool. It makes sense. It's also very difficult to like actually play. I'm also concerned about their mana base. It doesn't have many lands in it. It only has 27.
Yeah, 28, but still not very many.
Well, Dryad Arbor is like fake. Like that's
sure.
You can't really count that as a land because it dies so often. But I do think the Spellseeker and like Ephemerate endgame does make a lot of sense and probably cleans up a lot of those bullshit matchups that you're talking about. Because if you just go get Orange Chant plus Spellseeker plus Witness versus a bunch of the combo decks, they're dead. Like, they're actually dead.
Yeah, they can't do anything.
And, like, it does sound like it takes a while for that to set up. Then you realize the first Spellseeker sets that up almost by itself.
Yep.
Because you Spellseeker, you get Ephemerate, you Ephemerate the Spellseeker, you get Green Sun Zenith, you Zenith for Witness. Of course, all of this is very...
Ephemerate.
Yeah, of course, this is all very clunky, but the idea of the deck is to, like, get mana into play via Burst of Paradise, Carpet of Flowers, Green Sun Zenith. So, like, I think it actually happens way more often than it looks. It's just that, like, I think the deck is also extremely hard to play. And also, like, it probably has the issue that it leans on Brainstorm really, really hard. Because it has, like, a bunch of disjointed game plans fit into one deck, you know?
And only 3 Ponders.
The list I'm looking at only has 2, but, you know, whatever people want to do. It's kind of whatever. Yeah, so I probably wouldn't play that deck. Unless if you were willing to invest a lot of time, but also, like, it's weirdly bad versus, like, I think it's weirdly bad versus people who are trying to kill you as well. Yeah. Like, I don't know. I think that person is just very, very, very good at building a functional deck that attacks an unknown axis. Is how I would put it.
Yeah, I 1000% agree. Okay, I'm trying to think if there's any other questions I have for you. I appreciate it, and like, I'm guessing you already do agree with this, but you agree with my choice of playing Delver and something like this.
I think it's fine to play that. I think it's also fine to play probably Yorion Taxes or Naiadeps.
Yep.
Past that, I think, like, probably Moonstompy is okay to play. And I think if you really do enjoy the, like, 4-color or, like, Uro grind them down thing, it's probably okay. I just haven't seen a list that I would say, like, sings to me. Like, they all, like...
Sure.
I think the problem with most of them is I think they're almost all a little bit too greedy, is how I would put it. And they're not, like, respectful enough of their mana or, like, trying to have, like, a coherent plan versus combo is the other problem. Like...
Yeah, they do die almost immediately to combo.
Yeah, and I'm, like... I'm not sure, like... I suspect you could just do better somehow by, like, rebuilding your deck from the ground up, but I don't have time to figure that out. I think most people also don't spend time trying to figure that out either.
Yeah, I do agree with that. Okay, I think that's all I got, Jarvis. Thank you so much. This has been fantastic.
Yep, no problem. I'll probably upload it to YouTube in a bit and just send you the link, and then you can... I'm not going to publish it for a while, of course. I probably won't even publish it next week because I'll probably be busy trying to, like, wrap things up for DreamHack Atlanta.
Yeah, of course. Good luck there.
Yeah. So yeah, that's all I've got for you. And you know where to find me if you have any last minute questions.
Yeah, I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
I'm not actually that busy tomorrow or Saturday, so if you have last minute questions before the tournament, feel free.
Okay. Sounds good. I'll let you know if I do. I don't think I will, but I will let you know for sure.
Yep. All right.
Thanks again, dude.
Yep. I'm going to hop off. Bye-bye.
Sounds good. Bye-bye.